Have you ever wondered why your parents could buy a house on a single salary, while you're struggling to even consider a down payment? What happened to the American dream? Let's rewind to 1970. The average American home cost about 5 times the annual income of a single worker. Fast forward to today, and that number has nearly doubled to 10 times the average salary, and that's before you even factor in soaring interest rates and all the hidden fees. We see these old black and white clips of happy families moving into their first suburban homes. That was one generation's reality. The next generation? They're renting those same homes, potentially for the rest of their lives. So what went wrong? It's easy to blame inflation, but the real story is much deeper, much more complex. The very system that was supposed to bring prosperity quietly rewrote the rules of ownership right under our noses. This is the story of how home ownership was stolen. Not through war or widespread poverty, but by the financial machine that promised us a better future. The story of housing has always been the story of power. Throughout history, whoever controls the land controls the people. In the 20th century, the dream of owning a piece of that land was the very foundation of the American middle class. But today, that dream has become a trap, fueling a cycle of debt that feels impossible to escape. To truly understand why owning a home has become so out of reach, we need to go back to a time when it was not just possible, but expected. After World War II, millions of soldiers returned home to a country that made them a promise: stability. This promise wasn't just empty words, it was backed by concrete policies. Land was cheap. Mortgages had low interest rates. The government kept a tight rein on banks to prevent risky behavior. Crucially, wages kept pace with productivity. A single-income family could afford a house, a car, and even an annual vacation. Let's look at the numbers from 1970. The average home price was around $23,000. The median income was about $9,400. That means a house cost roughly 2.5 years of salary. Mortgage rates hovered around 7%. In that era, home ownership wasn't seen as a luxury or a privilege. It was a clear, attainable path to security and belonging. It was a time of incredible optimism, built on the core belief that each generation would be better off than the one before it. But that golden age, as we all know, didn't last. Every system built on the pursuit of profit eventually gets hungry for more. And that hunger began to reshape our world in the 1980s. A wave of deregulation swept through the financial industry. The floodgates were opened. Suddenly, interest rates shot through the roof. The purpose of housing began to shift. It was no longer primarily about providing shelter for families. It became a tool for speculation, an asset to be flipped for profit. With these new freedoms, banks began to make riskier and riskier bets. Developers saw homes not as communities but as entries on a balance sheet. The mortgage market, which was once a local affair between a community bank and a family, was transformed into a massive, impersonal, global machine. Your neighborhood loan officer was replaced by complex algorithms and distant investors. Then came the 1990s, and Wall Street cooked up a revolutionary and ultimately catastrophic new product: the mortgage-backed security. This was the game changer. Suddenly, your mortgage, the loan on your family's home, could be chopped up into tiny pieces, bundled with thousands of other mortgages, and traded on the stock market like any other commodity. The dream of ownership had been fully financialized. It was now part of the empire of debt. This securitization created a voracious appetite for more mortgages to feed the machine. It didn't matter if the borrowers could actually afford them. In fact, the riskier the loan, the higher the potential return for investors. This led directly to the subprime mortgage crisis. Banks and lenders started handing out ninja loans: no income, no job, or assets. They pushed adjustable rate mortgages with tempting low teaser rates that would balloon into unaffordable payments a few years down the line. The system was designed to get people into homes they couldn't afford, because the risk was no longer held by the local bank. It was packaged and sold off to investors around the world who had no idea what they were actually buying. The housing market became a casino. Prices soared to unbelievable heights, not because of genuine demand for shelter, but because of pure financial speculation. A massive bubble was forming, and the entire global economy was resting on it. Then, in 2008, the bubble burst. The house of cards collapsed. Millions of families who had been lured into these predatory loans faced foreclosure. They lost their homes, their savings, their security. The financial crisis that followed wasn't just a market correction. It was a cataclysm that wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth and plunged the world into the worst recession since the Great Depression. And who paid the price? Not the banks that caused the crisis. They were deemed too big to fail and received massive government bailouts. The price was paid by ordinary people. The middle class was hollowed out. A whole generation watched their parents lose everything, and their own dreams of home ownership evaporated along with it. In the aftermath, you'd think we would have learned our lesson. You'd think we would have put strong regulations back in place to prevent this from ever happening again. For a short time, some reforms were made. But the fundamental system didn't change. The empire of money just found new ways to operate. After the crash, home prices were low, but getting a loan became incredibly difficult unless you had perfect credit and a huge down payment. So who swooped in to buy up all those foreclosed homes? Not families. It was private equity firms and large institutional investors. They bought thousands of single-family homes at bargain bin prices, not to live in, but to turn into rental properties. Your competition for that starter home is no longer just another family. It's a multi-billion-dollar corporation with access to unlimited cash. They can outbid you every single time. They're not just buying houses, they're buying entire neighborhoods. They've turned a fundamental human need, shelter, into a reliable recurring revenue stream. You're no longer a homeowner building equity, you're a tenant building their portfolio. This brings us to today. The cost of homes has skyrocketed, driven by a shortage of supply and this new, massive demand from corporate investors. Wages, meanwhile, have stagnated for decades. The gap between what people earn and what it costs to buy a home has become a chasm. That ratio of 10 times your annual income is the direct result of this long, deliberate process. The system is no longer designed to help you buy a home. It's designed to keep you renting from those who can. The promise of stability has been replaced with the reality of perpetual precarity. We've traded the dream of ownership for the subscription model of life. So, is there any hope? Is the dream dead forever? Not necessarily. But fixing this problem requires more than just hoping for a market crash or working 3 jobs. It requires a fundamental shift in how we view housing. We need to demand policies that prioritize people over profit. This could mean stronger regulations on institutional investors buying up single-family homes, massive investments in building new, affordable housing, and creating new pathways to ownership that aren't dependent on the whims of Wall Street. The story of housing is the story of our society. It reflects our values, our priorities, and our vision for the future. We've allowed that story to be written by the empire of money for far too long. It's time for us to pick up the pen and start writing a new chapter, one where a safe and stable home is not a financial instrument, but a fundamental human right. One where the dream is not just a relic of the past, but a promise for the future. Have you ever wondered why buying a home feels less like a milestone and more like an impossible dream? Let's talk about how the American dream of homeownership turned into a global nightmare. Let's rewind to 2008. Remember the financial crisis? It wasn't just about banks and balance sheets, it was a moral collapse. Millions of people lost their homes, their savings, their security. Homes were sold, flipped, and foreclosed on an unimaginable scale. And when the dust finally settled, who was there to pick up the pieces? Not the families who lost everything, the powerful. Private equity giants like BlackRock and Invitation Homes saw an opportunity. They weren't just buying a house here and there. They swept in and bought thousands of homes in bulk, paying pennies on the dollar. Entire neighborhoods, once filled with homeowners, were transformed overnight into rental empires. For the first time in American history, the dynamic shifted in a terrifying way. Ordinary people didn't own their homes anymore. Their homes owned them. This wasn't just a blip on the radar. It was the beginning of a new era. The 2008 crisis lit the fuse, and the explosion is now global. Look around. From Toronto to London, from Sydney to Shanghai, the story is the same. The middle class, the very backbone of our economies, is being systematically priced out of the system it helped build. Think about it. Housing used to be a market driven by supply and demand by families looking for a place to live. Now, it's a monopoly of capital. It's a playground for global investors, pension funds, and faceless corporations. They aren't buying homes to live in, they're buying them as assets, as lines on a spreadsheet. They buy, they hold, they profit. And our governments? Instead of stepping in to protect citizens, they often subsidize these very investors. Tax breaks, incentives. It all fuels the fire. Meanwhile, what about the young generation? What about you? You're left to rent. You're trapped in a relentless cycle of rising rents, stagnant wages, and ever-increasing debt. The dream of saving up for a down payment fades a little more with every rent check you write. Hope becomes a luxury you can't afford. This is the new empire. It doesn't have flags or armies in the traditional sense. The empire of real estate has replaced the empire of nations. Its conquests are measured in square feet and rental yields. When land, the very foundation of our communities, becomes just another commodity to be traded for profit, then people become the collateral damage. Let's put this in perspective. Back in 1970, owning a home meant security. It was a foundation for your family, a place to build a life. Fast forward to today, and what does a home mean? For many, it simply means survival. It's a roof over your head that you're barely hanging on to. This isn't just about economics, it's about power. It's empire in disguise. Empires always come with a grand promise, don't they? They promise growth, prosperity, a better future for all. But look closer. What they really create is dependence. They create a system where a handful of entities control the most essential human need: shelter. You become dependent on them for a place to live, subject to their terms, their rent hikes, their decisions. And here's the thing about empires. A lesson history has taught us time and time again. Every single one of them falls. Think of Rome. Its collapse wasn't triggered just because the poor had nothing left to lose. It fell when the concentration of wealth and power at the very top became so extreme, so unsustainable, that the entire structure crumbled under its own weight. The fall happens not when the poor have nothing, but when the rich own everything. We are living through a profound shift in how our world is organized. The rules have changed. The game is rigged. As the saying goes, when shelter becomes a commodity, humanity becomes debt. If you want to understand the hidden forces shaping our world, if you want to see how money and power have built and are now breaking the modern world, then you're in the right place. We're going to pull back the curtain on these new empires of capital. Thanks for watching. If this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to Decode Empires and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. See you in the next video.